Good morning. Hello, welcome everybody. Dear President of the Austrian National Council, dear President of the Federal Council, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome in Vienna. Welcome to Vienna. In my function as chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Austrian National Council, it is a great honor for me to welcome you and to meet the chair and today to chair the Interparliamentary Conference for the Common Foreign and Security Policy and the Common Security and Defense Policy, together with the chairman of the Defense Committee of the Austrian National Council, Mr. Reinhard BÖSCH, and the chairman of the Committee on Foreign Affairs of the European Parliament, Mr. McALLISTER. And as it seems to be necessary, the conference has to be opened officially, which I will declare now. And then we come, without any further delay, I would ask our President of the Austrian National Council, Mr. Wolfgang SOBOTKA, to take the floor and to deliver his welcome address.
Sehr geehrte Abgeordnete,
Members of Parliament of this Interparliamentary Conference for the Joint Foreign and Security Policy and the Joint Security and Defense Policy chairs of the Defense Committee of the National Council and the Foreign Policy Committee of the European Parliament, and Madam President of the Federal Council. Ladies and gentlemen, for us, this conference is a very decisive and a very important event. I think that the parliamentary dimension has grown since the Lisbon Treaty and has gathered more momentum. And in the course of our presidency of the European Council, we think that Vienna, as a traditional venue for conferences, for a meeting, and for dialogues, want to position Vienna particularly in a situation where Europe, and where many say that Europe has reached a certain turning point, and where Europe has a special position and task within world politics. I think that foreign politics and foreign policy, especially foreign politics in the sense of a joint and harmonized appearance of Europe, is also a task of the national parliaments and of parliaments altogether. And all treaties will always go through Parliament, the European Parliament and the national parliament. We've seen that with CETA, and we also had very intensive discussions in this connection, and this is why it is necessary that within your own sphere you create that awareness, and especially members of parliament have that task to form that European framework and to foster this European framework within their national settings, and to consider that to be their task. And finally, all accessions to international organizations and all decisions on budgets, also for foreign politics and also for development politics and for what we call international cooperation politics, will always go through Parliament. And Austria's Parliament is taking this foreign policy task very seriously, especially in connection with the neighboring countries. Only recently, I joined the president of the parliaments of the Czech Republic and Slovakia at Kremzir, where we developed a common strategy how we would position ourselves in the extension and expansion of the European Union concerning the Balkan states, and where we want to have a common stand. And it is also equally important to have that orientation in security policy, and you know the challenges that we have had to cope with in recent years. All speeches deal with it, and when I was Minister of the Interior, this was a very important topic, fighting terrorism, protecting the external borders, cybercriminality, and all other conflicts that we can see here today, and where we need new approaches. And the migration issue Many think that this is no longer the decisive issue because there are shorter and smaller flows of migrations, but the consequences can still be found everywhere in all or many of the European countries. And what we have seen in the past 2 years in particular is that Europe is taking a new orientation and needs a new orientation vis-à-vis Africa, not in the sense of a development policy, but a cooperation policy, cooperation among equals with the necessary respect and understanding. And we hope that the EU-Africa Forum on the 18th of December will give us new chances and impulses which are necessary in order to have a successful policy for the years to come and to determine such a policy. And I can see that from my own field of action, the return of refugees when we began, and when I was a Minister of the Interior, when we began putting up serious projects, the preparedness of governments was much higher, and the people that left their countries to come to Austria or Europe for economic reasons, here they had to be taken back, but because they had no reason for being granted asylum. And I think what we need to establish and determine very clearly, and I think many experts also say so, when we speak about a turning point here in Europe, what we will need also is this capability to be able to work on in international politics. And I think that Europe should speak with one voice. Just bear in mind that if the Human Rights Council of the United Nations, if we have to give a vote as Europe, then this is no longer possible. This principle of unanimity is keeping us, is preventing us. So there must be a discussion as to how we will reach a possibility for a qualified majority, so that according to our structures and our values, we will be able to express that we are Europe as a whole, and it should not only the specific situation of a country that has specific contacts to a third country will keep us from expressing an opinion and keeps us from expressing a vote by unanimity. Now, in commercial policies and economic policies, we have that. If you look at the recent controversies here and how the European Union presented itself, I think we were quite successful there. And I'm very happy that Madam Mogherini, as the High Commissioner of the European Union, will send us her message today, because in her field of politics, it is also very important to have that majority behind her in order to be able to present herself in a uniform way. And it will also be very decisive that in connection with the joint defense and security policy, we will need this majority principle so that cooperation, and PESCO is a first step here, but we need to be more effective on an international level and platform. I think it starts with our neighboring countries, and here we have to present ourselves very clearly, be that Ukraine or Austria, and this is our own personal interest. It is the southeastern part of Europe or the Balkan countries. If we say that the European Union is a peace project and has offered Europe 70 years of peace, then I wonder, how do we define Europe? Isn't on the Balkans part of the Europe? Oh, yes. In major parts of Europe, we've succeeded in establishing a system of peace and cooperation and to organize this kind of life. But we haven't been able to avoid and to give up many of the crisis points. And for many centuries, we've had these conflict zones, and it was always on the Balkans where, in particular, they affected us. And all the major controversies of the 19th and of the 20th century thus also gave rise to conflicts, and this always commenced on the Balkans. So we have to give these 6 countries as well some perspective of how they can join the European Union. Wherever whenever they are exposed to the influences of Russia or the influences of Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and China. I've just had the visit of a Chinese delegation, and they're very committed throughout Europe, and they are very active throughout Europe, especially the countries that have not yet become part of the European Union, in order to help them build up some infrastructure and helping them to have a good initial and departing position. It is up to us, and we have the strategic interest in these countries, so we have to also set a clear sign there. So we have to think about how we can set up and define an economic area before we have full accession, because if there is full accession, it has to be quite clear that the principles and the basis that we have developed as a European Union, that they are also can also be implemented fully, and that we do not give any discount for accession to the European Union, and that legal certainty and judicial independence, etc., are topics that will be built up afterwards. Because we have to be aware that there are countries where these issues are a major challenge. It's a major challenge for us as well to have that legal certainty. So the Berlin process that started in 2014 by the national countries, where the civil society was also included, that it should also be raised to the parliamentary level and should be enlarged and be taken up on the parliamentary level. And the West Balkans is for the old Austrian parliament, not only during the presidency, but also beyond. Here we take a major interest because we have this democracy workshop, and we want to explain what is the essence of democracy. We want to bring that closer to the civil population, and in the Kosovo and Montenegro, we are ready to start with this project. We want to give scholarships, and these scholarships will bring staff members of the parliaments to the European Union, to European Union member states, to show them parliamentary procedure in the committees, in the plenary, but also the underlying work. So you see that we have quite a wide range of activities here, and I thank you for your large participation here. It shows that parliamentarism is an essential support for Europe, so that in the future citizens in Europe will have prosperity, security, and the fundamental rights and freedoms that we all need in order to be able to position ourselves on the international policy level as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President. And now I will ask Lady President, the President of the Federal Council, to give her introductory remarks. Inge POSCH-GRUSKA.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, chairs, President. Also from my side, I would like to warmly welcome you here today to this Interparliamentary Conference. This conference is a further very important meeting, which is part of a series with respect to the interparliamentary dimension. I think it's very important that the dialogue between parliamentarians in the individual parliamentary houses of all of the member states is maintained. I think that only by sharing our opinions and knowledge on a regular basis and being actively involved will it enable the European parliaments to be able to meet the important challenges and making the correct decisions for European affairs. As President of the Federal Council of Austria, I'm particularly proud that of the work of our EU committee in the Council. They're very committed, very active, and they take very seriously their co-determination duties and rights. So they are one of the most active houses of parliament in Europe in terms of ensuring the principle of subsidiarity. And that's a very important principle for us in the European Union. But I would like to warn against those who might use subsidiarity in a negative way. The truth of the matter is that the confidence of the citizens in the European Union has dropped off in recent years, and there have been a growing loudness, a greater volume of voices negative against the European Union. Important global challenges must and can only be addressed if we work together. So we have to act together, and to act together at all political levels. The Austrian Federal Council is an interface between our country, our regions, and the European level. And for that reason, I think that our Federal Council is a European parliamentary house, and also a parliamentary house for the future. We are agreed that the EU has to be crisis-proof without that compromising the prosperity of its citizens. The Austrian government has the motto, "A Europe that protects," for this presidency. And I think, in my understanding of this, it's important that this protects the prosperity of the citizens as well. And it is this balance between the economic issues and the prosperity issues which we have to support in the European Union. So we need growth, we need employment policies, but we also need social policies. So, ladies and gentlemen, if we're talking about a Europe that protects, then obviously we should not forget the need for security among our citizens. The president of the National Assembly had gesagt that he is not so sure about the view of peace of the European Union, but it's very important to remember that the European Union has been a great peace project for our time. And it's very important that we also succeed in creating peace not only within the European Union, but also in our neighborhood. And it is this challenge, in order to meet this challenge, and to take on this responsibility and be equal to it, the European Union needs to have a resilient European security and defense policy. Today's conference will contribute to strengthening those policies. If you take a look at your agenda, then it shows quite clearly that you have very complex issues to deal with and very complex challenges to consider. So I would like to emphasize that I find the interparliamentary dialogue an incredibly important issue, and it's very important that we have I hope you have very constructive discussions, but also enjoy being here in our beautiful city of Vienna. Thank you.
Thank you, Inge, and dear Mr. President, dear Madam President, dear co-chairs, I want to not only welcome you warmly here in Vienna, I also want to explain a little bit why we had been choosing this conference venue. Because first of all, the Austrian Parliament, the main building, is under construction, because after more than 100 years of an old house, it is necessary also to renovate it completely. On the other side also, it would have been too small to host such a big conference. The original venue for conferences during the Austrian presidency was the conference center next to the United Nations headquarters, but due to too much conferences, we could not book it, and therefore we came here to the Erste campus, which is generally owned by an Austrian bank, but also it has additionally symbolic, interesting impacts. Let me explain why. Because in the neighborhood here is the so-called Central Railway Station. In the past, it was the Austrian Südbahnhof, the South Railway Station, and it's one of the main stations where a lot of personal experiences and history was written. First of all, it's a railway station where people are simply going to the holidays. So all of us experience to leave from here to go to the Adriatic Sea, to the countries which nowadays we would call Balkans. In these days we call it Yugoslavia, to Italy, and all experience nice summers. On the other side is also a gate of incoming visitors, tourists, which are coming to Austria and seeing here also what's going on. And this, I think, it is also for a lot of people the first encounter which was called the West during these days. And as a narrative of our city here in Vienna, many memories and stories about this place coming to my mind. The one story of Vienna is connected with this train station. It is also connected with this symbolic being a bridge between the East and the West. The one is, for example, JFK, John F. Kennedy, the American president, also in parentheses, one of the real good presidents, which we would deserve nowadays also strongly, and Nikita Khrushchev, the Russian, these days Russian reformist president, met in 1961 here in Vienna. And Mr. Khrushchev came by the way by train and arrived also in this old Südbahnhof station. And you see also this east-west bridge of also constructive talks had something to do with this South Railway Station. In 1956, after the crisis in Hungary, 180,000 people sought refuge in Austria, and also most of them came here in this region. In 1968, Vienna has seen the consequences of the Prague Spring and also of its defeat, and received a lot of people coming from Czechoslovakia also to Austria. And we have to say also on the other side, in the 60s and in the 70s, the economic boom started, and 80% of migrant workers coming mainly from Yugoslavia also arrived here in this place, coming to Austria. So therefore it is not such a bad place also be choosing here, because a lot of European history also put its footprints into the face of the city. Ladies and gentlemen, after this short excursion to the history, maybe to come to our program today. The session one, and explain why, session one is about refugees, migrants and security. In 2015, thousands of refugees and migrants arrived in Vienna within a few days. Many stayed in Austria, but even more decided to move to other EU countries like Germany and Sweden. A lot of changed in our country since then. The political atmosphere, we have to say, and also the political power has shifted. The first session on security, migration and external border control will be dealing also with the consequences of the migrant crisis, and I assume that we will agree that a better managed international migration is a global responsibility. I believe that in this session we should not only discuss how to further build the fortress Europe, but we need also to debate very strongly on how we can combat the origins of migration. This means also doing more than just increasing development aid, as also our President mentioned before. It means that we need a new North-South relationship, and we need to end the exploitation of numerous states, and we need to rethink development cooperation. In this context, let me also mention that the Austrian EU presidency will have an EU-Africa summit at the middle of December, in 18th of December, here in Vienna. And they will, together with the President of the African Union, which is the President of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, and the President of the European Commission, Mr. Juncker, will also discuss economic issues such as innovation and digitalization, which is also a chance for a new, fair relation between Europe and Africa. The second session, our second session, will focus on the contribution to the improvement of the political and humanitarian situation in Syria. 56% of all people who were granted asylum in Austria last year came from Syria. The conflict in Syria continues to go on, and is one of the largest reasons for refugee crisis. More than 5.6 million Syrians are registered as refugees in their neighboring countries, with the crisis is going on in its 8th year. So therefore, I think it's extremely important to discuss how we go on with this issue, and we have to be clear, it is in the sake of interest of the European Union to find solution and to be strongly involved in these issues. Let us discuss today and tomorrow how we continue and even increase support. For example, Austria is one of the 3rd biggest contributor to the EU Regional Trust Fund in response to the Syrian crisis. But it's not only about discussing how much money we can spend, it is also about how we can support those countries which are giving home and shelter to refugees in the region and in the area. An inclusive dialogue should remain our priority, and we should also urge all key actors to return to the negotiation table. This, I think, it is important, and therefore the UN-led process on Geneva is one of the core issues. So, ladies and gentlemen, to come to an end, I think we will have an experience of discussing the key issues. Other ones had been mentioned also, like the Western Balkans, which are extremely important. And I hope that we will also use the conference and the next month to discuss what policy Europe makes and not only how we do. So the next speaker is Mr. McALLISTER, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee from the European Parliament.
Frau Präsidentin des Bundesrats, Herr Präsident des
Ladies and gentlemen,
just make some very brief remarks. First of all, it's a great pleasure to see you all today. Thank you for being here in Vienna for 2 days of intense discussions, and indeed we have an interesting and very dense program. I would like to congratulate the Austrian presidency on the efficient organization of this conference and thank our hosts for the warm welcome. In particular, I would like to express my gratitude to Mr. Andreas SCHIEDER, the chairperson of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and also Mr. Reinhard Eugen BÖSCH, the chairman of the Defense Committee, for the excellent cooperation in the preparation of this conference. Let's say real thanks to our Austrian hosts for that. Now, I was just informed that the High Representative and Vice President of the European Commission is connected to this conference per video since 11:45. Federica Mogherini is already waiting, and you must understand that I can't let the High Representative and the Vice President of the European Commission be waiting any longer. So without any further ado, and we'll have enough opportunities later on to discuss many issues which are important for us in the European Parliament, I would now like to give the floor to Federica Mogherini. Federica, are you there?
No.
This is Vienna calling. We would like to announce the vote of the European... Hey guys, you told me that she's waiting. There's a technical problem. Oh. Okay, well then I'm happy to give the floor to Mr. BÖSCH for his speech. I think I'm finished with my speech. That's good. Okay.
Herr Präsident,
President,
liebe Co-Vorsitzende, meine Damen und Herren,
presidents,
es ist erfreulich,
co-chairs, ladies and gentlemen,
zu meiner
I'm very happy that a little technical problem has allowed me to take the floor, because it's a very positive beginning for me for the conference. But all the same, we won't want to miss out on the High Representative's speech.
aller Mitgliedsländer
All of the member states
Es ist mir eine besondere Ehre, Sie heute
value her work. So it is an honor for me as co-chair to welcome you to this conference.
die Gastbund GSVB-Konferenz
This conference has become a very well-established forum,
Austausch von
a forum which allows us to exchange our experience and our points of view among the European level and the member states. the NATO members as well, whether or not they're members of the EU. In terms of topics, this conference covers a very large spectrum of products, and we want to be sure to take up the baton where our Bulgarian friends have handed it over to us. And we would like to pass on to our Romanian colleagues and friends next year. As parliamentarians, it is our duty to maintain an overview and look to the future in order to recognize which topics will be important in the future. And the European Union is faced with increasingly complex challenges, and we should not close our eyes to those challenges. That's why this very broad approach that we use in this conference is so valuable, so that we can cover the whole spectrum from military capability, but we can also focus on a better connection between internal and external politics and civil and military issues. That is why in session 1 we are going to concentrate on migration, security and external borders. These are very broad topics, but they're very, very closely interwoven with each other. And in the last couple of years it has become very clear that it's very important to develop a integrated European policy for this level. We have to have coherence between internal and external policy, and we have to cover all of the migration rates. Our approach is to focus on solidarity and to keep the rules of international law, and to show solidarity. So the National Council President and also the President of the Federal Council has brought up Europe Protects. But this means that we have to try to protect people. We have a human and political challenge because we have to deal with irregular migration, and also find a response to forced relocation of people. So we have to work with the countries of origin, we have to work with the transit lands. It's essential to do that, to try and tackle the factors that force people to flee their homes. And we will go into detail in the session on this. In order to address all the issues that force people to leave their homes will take a long time. But until then, those who are fleeing should not have to turn to human smugglers, because this is leading to an unnecessary loss of lives in the Mediterranean. And organized criminal is important to address, but they also use the money. The money is also then being channeled into terrorist activities. It is important to have a sustainable political reaction to this, and it's essential to take the approach of putting everything into having effective protection of the external borders in the European Union. We have to prevent illegal entry into the European Union. We have to fight against the smuggling of people. We have to, I think, we have to all want to do this. We all recognize the importance of this, and the Austrian presidency wants to offer an approach to tackle these problems. We know that we have reached a fork in the road in the European Union. The President of the National Council has touched upon it. We need to have more forces from at the European Union level to protect the borders, so that Europe is in a situation whereby they can play a role on the world stage. In session 3, I hear that the High Representative is ready to speak to us. So, ladies and gentlemen, I wish you the very best for the rest of the conference, and thank you for your attention. Can you hear me?
Welcome.
I thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation, but most of all for the flexibility of arranging this innovative way of having our conversation today. I am not sure I hear you very well. Maybe we can work on the volume on our side. You hear me well?
Yes.
I guess you do. Good. So I'll first of all, I want to thank you and I want to apologize because we have been meeting regularly every presidency, every 6 months more or less, with these important moments of exchange, not only with the members of the European Parliament, which I meet regularly in Strasbourg and Brussels, but also with members of the national parliaments. This time, unfortunately, this was not possible for me to join you in Vienna, and I didn't want to address you with a video message that is not interactive. And what is valuable for me in this kind of exchanges we have regularly is the possibility to interact and to hear your views and your questions more than giving a speech. So if you allow me, I will not give you a speech and be very brief in my introductions and then leave time for questions and comments and an exchange among us. First of all, let me say that these 6 months of the Austrian presidency, as foreseen, are and will continue to be intense on the foreign and security policy point of view. We have seen it already a couple of weeks ago in New York during the General Assembly of the United Nations. We're living times when the European Union is perceived, and rightly so, as a point of reference for many around the world on many different files, starting from the defense of multilateralism and the multilateral system, not only the defense of it, but also the reform of it. I can share with you, I was quite impressed in New York. I think we had a record number of events and meetings organized jointly by the European Union and the United Nations, by myself and the Secretary General of the United Nations, to show and to clearly have as a picture this EU-UN partnership in all the different files we are covering, from sustainable development to climate change to migration to the different crises we have around us. From Syria to Libya to the Middle East peace process, to the Balkans, with a special mention that I would like to make for a trilateral cooperation that we have established and that I think is extremely successful so far, needs to be intensified in these months, which is the trilateral cooperation we have established between the European Union, the United Nations and the African Union, that helps us working not only on migration, but also on migration, but also on peace and security, on conflict prevention, crisis management, and on economic investments in especially the most fragile areas of the continent. I think of the Sahel or the Horn of Africa, some areas of Africa where we are channeling also private investments to support job creation, especially for youth and women. The topics on the agenda for this months, both from work done in the European institutions, governments and parliaments, is very intense, not particularly new compared to previous presidencies. I would maybe like to underline 2 additional points on top of the work we do on multilateralism and in partnership with the United Nations and with the African Union. One is the work on defense. I was just listening to the previous speaker. The work on strengthening and advancing the European Union defense is intensifying. We will have new steps to be taken in the coming months. The permanent structured cooperation projects are advancing well. I can give as an example the one on military mobility that we're doing in strong cooperation with NATO, showing that strengthening and deepening the EU defense goes hand in hand with deepening and strengthening partnership and cooperation with NATO. And I would expect that this work of intensified EU defense and security work in line with the more strategic autonomy of our continent will be supported by the national parliaments as well. Defense committees, but also foreign affairs committees, and at a certain moment maybe also the economic ones, because we will need also to discuss the budget perspectives with which we can support this work. That I want to underline very clearly, we do it often in the European Parliament, it is not and will never be a militarization of the European Union work abroad. It is a matter of autonomy. It is a matter of deciding how and where and when. Also the use of, in some cases, military force can be useful, but always in the European way, which is always aware of the fact that military means might be needed from time to time, but never sufficient alone, and always in a context that includes mediation, conflict prevention, development aid, and reconciliation and peace processes to get out of a conflict. It is even more important in these times to be able to count on European Union capacities to do so, and not to depend on anybody else to take our decisions on how to promote peace and security in our region and elsewhere in the world. So I count on this work on defense to advance, continue to advance in the coming months. We just sent to the Council yesterday the new wave of the new package of PESCO projects. 17 of them are already up and running. There will be soon a decision on new projects that will be added to that, as well as discussions and hopefully agreement among member states participating to PESCO on the modalities of the participation of third countries to specific projects that might be of interest for us to be open to other countries. The second specific point I want to mention before then having an exchange with you is the Balkans. I know this is a priority for the Austrian presidency. I know it is a priority for the Austrian Parliament, and I know it is a priority for many of the parliaments, if not all, that are represented in our meeting today, and starting from the European Parliament. And I value this enormously. We have to, I believe, conclude the mandate of this Commission with good and consolidated results on the Western Balkan region as such, in each and every country of the region. Each and every of them living complicated times, some more challenging than others. But for the entire region, I still believe that this is a moment of acceleration of the European Union path. I still see a strong determination and a good opportunity for all of them to proceed on that direction. And I see a strong political will on the European Union side, and this is a good opportunity for me to ask the support of national parliaments in this, to make sure that that this process is consolidated during this presidency, and then during the Romanian presidency following the Austrian one. We have an exceptional window of opportunities given by the fact that the presidencies are for a certain number of months and years actually very close to the region, if not part of the region. This can help enormously, and here the role of parliaments is extremely important. The Balkans, you know that better than me, is a region where government-to-government contacts and institutional work alone is important, but the political work, the work that parties do, parliamentary groups do, parliamentary committees do, is extremely relevant. Many of you have helped in the years that we just lived, and will continue, I hope, to help in accompanying this process of deep economic and social and rule of law reforms in each of these countries, and also some of the very important reconciliation processes that are ongoing. So I count on your continued support to make sure that the Western Balkans continue to advance on the European Union path. I will stop here. I skipped many of the points that I'm sure you will raise in your comments and questions, but also because for me, as you know me, it is very important to use this opportunity not just to pass to you a message, but also to get a feedback from you on how you see our priorities in foreign and security policy for these times, and have a possibility to interact as much as we can. It's the first time we have this exchange by video conference. Again, I hope it works. And I'm really sorry I couldn't be personally in Vienna, but I'm just literally now back to Brussels from visits that have brought me to Spain, Portugal, Germany, and Helsinki in the last 3 days. In all of them, I've had meetings with governments. It is essential for me to integrate that with an exchange with parliaments that, as you know, I value particularly in the work we're doing. So I thank you very much for the opportunity, for the flexibility, and looking forward to hearing your views and exchange on them. Thank you.
Dear Federica, this is Dave McAllister speaking. Can you hear me? Is there a technician here?
I do.
She can hear me?
I hear you.
Hi, Federica.
you.
Thanks for
Hi.
your introductory remarks. Now, first question, when do you have to leave this video conference?
David, believe me or not, but I will have to leave to go to the European Parliament, where we have the conference on the electoral observation missions with your colleagues that have stayed in Brussels. So I'm afraid I will have 20 minutes, 15 minutes.
Okay, you have 15 minutes. We have 9 speakers. I suggest in this case we do 1 question, 1 answer, 1 question, see how far we get. Try to keep it as brief as possible, the questions and also the answers. So the first is from Latvia, Mr. Kalnīns.
Yes, hello Federica, it's good to see you again, even if it's virtual, Federica. In terms of common EU and foreign security policy, the EU neighborhood policy has been one of the most important ones because it's intended to prevent and resolve conflict around the EU. Internal security obviously depends on external security, and we've understandably focused here on Syria, North Africa, and the Balkans. Yet one of the closest and bloodiest conflicts to the European Union remains in Ukraine, just several hundred kilometers from the EU border. 11,000 people have died since 2014. They continue to die every day. Does the EU have any new initiatives to try to end this tragedy and threat to European security?
Okay, thanks for keeping it short. Federica?
First of all, hi, and thank you for the question, and it's a pleasure also to see you again, even if virtually or from far away. On the conflict in Ukraine, we do not have any new initiatives in preparation. We are, and we have been continuing to support and to follow the work done through the Normandy format, even if this has been slowing down a bit in the recent year. And my impression is that with the upcoming elections in Ukraine, there will not end the clear lack of willingness on the Russian side to engage seriously on the Minsk implementation. I do not see many steps forward being made currently. What we have been following and discussing, in particular with our Ukrainian friends, with the President and with the Prime Minister and with the Foreign Minister, the idea of involving a UN presence there. Seems to me that consensus in the Security Council is far from being not only achieved but even constructed. It is extremely important for us to work on this file in connection with Ukraine, with whom we have, as you know, a very successful association agreement and DSFTA that we are continuing to implement at full, and listen to their ideas on how they believe the situation can be unblocked. So we are continuing to work a lot with them, coordinating with the United States that had some ideas but are also now a bit slowing down. I'm That's my sense on the idea of new initiatives. So I'm afraid that no new initiatives are on the horizon, but work continues and the objectives continue. And as you know, the work to keep the consensus on the European Union member state side on the sanctions we imposed in 2014 on Russia for the war in Ukraine continue to be in place. And I count on that consensus to remain in place.
Thank you for this statement on Ukraine. The next speaker is Tobias Flüger from Germany.
Ja, vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. I have two questions, two issues. First of all, I am concerned about PESCO, the joint structured cooperation. And here we have the law in Germany, and we have very much involvement of the German National Council. And my question and my appeal to you is that we see that to be a very skeptical development, this PESCO development, but we would like to be ensured is that involvement of the Parliament is ensured. We can see time and again that only to a limited extent the information is passed on, the information about these issues to the national parliaments, and therefore I think that this information should go on very quickly. And the second point, very briefly, concerning the Armament Fund that you've just mentioned. Here my question is, you say that it promotes industry, but we think that is in in contradiction to Article 42 of the treaties, where it says that using the EU budget for military matters is prevented. How do you explain this contradiction?
First of all, no, there is no contradiction. Maybe there is a bit of a misunderstanding, but we are ready to provide all the clarifying papers you can study to get more clarity on this. There are two different things on the table. One is a fund, a budget, EU budget fund, that supports the industry in the sector of defense, and namely research projects, but also industrial projects, European industrial projects and research projects. And this is perfectly in line with what has been done previously. This is perfectly in line with the treaties. I can assure you that the legal services of the European Union institutions are extremely strict in evaluating what is according to the treaties and what is not. So there is absolutely nothing that is done that is going beyond the capacities and the possibilities we have by our treaties. And in fact, for this fund, it is not me, the leading Vice President of the Commission. It is my colleague Katainen and Bienkowska that are dealing with industrial and research activities, because it is a fund to support industrial and research-based activities. The second proposal that is on the table, and that is my proposal, that has the support so far of the Commission, and as far as I see, the Council is rather positive about that, and I count also on the positive support of the Parliament, is the establishment of budget of a European peace facility that would allow us to finance, not through the European Union budget, but through contributions of member states, mainly our missions and operations around the world, which we are already financing in this manner, but not with the predictability of the funding we have, and most of all, the capacity to work with our partners. I give you an example. We train and we work with the African Union for the many different crises and wars that are there in the continent. Think of Somalia, think of the Horn of Africa, think of the Sahel. There is a limit to what we can do so far in training and equipping these partners. With this European Peace Facility, we would be able to do more in supporting the security forces of our partners around the world, not only in Africa, to do this work that is fundamental for our own peace and security. When it comes to involvement of parliaments in following PESCO developments, I am afraid this is a matter for competence of national governments to inform national parliaments of the projects that they are running in PESCO. I imagine that defense ministers of member states would see this as an inappropriate ingerence from my side if I were to communicate directly with the national governments of member states on projects in which member states' governments are involved. I remind you that PESCO is a European Union project, but it's a project in which member states have the lead. For what concerns the European Union institutions, for what concerns me personally, I am always not only doing it because it's a duty, but also with pleasure informing the European Parliament at different levels, being it plenary, being it committees, being it in the special committee we have, on the state of play and on the implementation of our PESCO project. And I think it is extremely valuable to have a very open, transparent channel to keep the parliaments informed, both at European and national level, on the state of implementation of PESCO. So I encourage all governments to do that in the most transparent manner.
Thank you. Next speaker is Mr. Fassino from Italy.
Thank you very much. A very warm word of greeting to Madam Mogherini. Two questions. First, relations with Russia. You spoke about the question of Ukraine. What is the more general strategy of action of the European Union? I remember when there was the enlargement of European Union and of NATO, and Russia was against it, we tried to reduce that hostility, and we had the first partnership agreement, and then we had the first Council of Cooperation with Russia. Today we live in a very difficult moment. So what kind of strategy are you planning beyond the simple imposition of sanctions? Second question, in his speech on the State of the Union, Mr. Juncker recalled a proposal which had been already submitted by Madame Merkel and Mr. Macron about the possibility of switching from unanimity to a qualified majority as far as PESCO was concerned. But some decisions, some important decisions have been blocked. I'm referring to questions with China, the embargo on Russia, and other questions on Sahel, for example. So what is your personal assessment, and what kind of steps is the Commission planning to do on this?
Grazie mille ed è veramente un piacere, se posso andare oltre al protocollo, vederti anche.
And thank you very much for your question.
Federica, it's fine.
Ok, grazie. Sulla Russia.
On Russia, sanctions are not a strategy in themselves. They're only a tool to exercise some pressure in relation to a very serious question concerning Ukraine and Crimea. Our relations with Russia go very well beyond sanctions. Clearly, there are no conditions to go back to a partnership relation with Russia, as we tried to do in 2014, as long as the situation in Ukraine and Crimea does not change, and as long as the Minsk agreement is not implemented. But there is a relation between European Union and Russia going beyond sanctions, covering sectors and areas of work which are of strategic interest for us in Europe. Specific questions of foreign policy. I'm referring to the work that we've been conducting together with Russia, with China, and with other players in the world to try and maintain the nuclear deal with Iran. I'm referring to the work we do with Russia in the Quartet as far as the Middle East process, Israel and Palestine is concerned. And then I'm referring to the dialogue with Russia, which is a difficult one, but which is very important as far as Libya and Syria are concerned. This morning, I've just come back from Finland, and Finland teaches us how cooperation with Russia is fundamental, for example, in relation to the Arctic region. So a strategy of selected commitment on questions which are of vital interest for the European Union is a very good strategy. So we are interested in cooperating with Russia while maintaining a firm stance as far as the conflict in the Ukraine is concerned. One more aspect. In our relations with Russia, we've been working to maintain relations between European and Russian societies. I'm referring to not to companies, but to civil societies. And, for example, there are many Russian students taking part in the Erasmus project. Or I'm referring to the action of human rights activists, for example. And these are relations of strategic importance for our future relations with Russia. So we have to maintain one channel of communication open in people-to-people contacts. As to the majority voting that has been proposed by President Juncker on some points of foreign policy and security policy, this proposal shall be considered by all member states, by the Council. And it's true, in some areas of our work, and I'm referring to the Human Rights Council in Geneva, searching for a majority is quite a difficult challenge. My personal experience over the last 4 years is the following. I can't remember one moment when we couldn't find unanimous agreement within the Defense Council or the Foreign Affairs Council. Even in relation to Brexit or in relation to PESCO, we were able to reach unanimity when we had to decide to launch PESCO. But there's a lack of coherence as far as national policies are concerned. And so political will is at stake in this field. So we need to have coherence, consistency between unanimous decisions in Brussels and the decisions of individual states in their domestic policies. So I'm afraid that this is not a question relating to rules of procedure, but this is a question related to the possibility of taking on responsibility on the part of individual member states. And we have to remind us of that.
Thank you. Next speaker is Mr. Zoltan Emmett from Hungary.
Thank you, David. Warm greetings to you, Federica. I would like to come back also to a moment to the issue of the Ukraine. We have got two major problems with the Ukrainian-Russian situation. One is obviously the war between the Ukraine and Russia. The other question is the quality of democracy in the Ukraine. We all know that there are large minorities, except the Russians, in the Ukraine, and they experience a growing level of intolerance. A very narrow-minded Education Act has been adopted recently, and just last week we have seen the adoption of a very intolerant language law, which basically excludes from the public sphere all other languages than the Ukrainian. And then I haven't mentioned Mr. Banderas's statues and street names, which demonstrate higher and higher level of tensions in the Ukrainian society. How about the democracy inside the Ukraine? What are the instruments and what are our efforts in order to help that? Thank you very much.
Thank you. This is a question that I very often address, not only with the authorities in Hungary, but also in other member states, and most of all with the authorities in Ukraine. I've discussed it most recently during the General Assembly in my bilateral meetings with our Ukrainian friends, and also during my last visit in Ukraine a few months ago. We have constantly been encouraging and asking to the Ukrainian authorities to guarantee the full respect of the rights of minorities in the country, being it related to language, education, And we have suggested that the best way to go forward on this is to have open and direct contacts and elements for participation of these minorities in the decision-making through a consultative process and a dialogue. So we have been encouraging them to do so, as well as we are working on strengthening the institutions in a sense of democracy, rule of law, anti-corruption. A lot of our support to Ukraine goes to reforming the system, the institutions in all these sectors that are fundamental for the Ukrainians, being the majority or minority with a background of majority or minority. This to say that the success of the country, I believe, will be based most of all in its capacity to consolidate reforms. I remember very well the Maidan movement was asking, yes, for sure, a European Western orientation of the country, but was asking most of all a different way of having the institutions working, transparency, anti-corruption, economic reforms, and all of this is extremely important. And this is the core of our work with our Ukrainian friends. Most of our support, most of our work with them is focused on this: anti-corruption, rule of law, transparency, and respect of minority. On this, I know that the Venice Commission of the Council of Europe has been working very much with them, and we support and encourage this work 100%. And this is an issue we raised, and I personally raise every time we meet.
Thank you. Next is Roderich Kiesewetter from Germany.
Herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much. And I have a core issue from my perspective. We focus too much on the protection of the external borders and not so much on the European responsibility concerning the consequences of this protection of the external borders. I think we need to be fair and responsible vis-à-vis our neighbors, especially in the south. So my question is, how can PESCO be improved in a sense so that it becomes more operational and more effective, also with regard to reforms of the security sectors in Africa? And how can we manage that partnership projects where individual European countries within the framework of PESCO get together in order to take more care of certain countries in Africa than so far? And the next step, where new initiatives we need, and you said there are not enough new initiatives, so if we have new initiatives concerning external border protection, but also more security and safety in the countries such as Tunisia and Algeria, and closer to the Sahel zone. Thank you very much.
Thank you. There are, well, I didn't mention the protection of external borders. I know that that has been mentioned a lot, but not by me during this debate. The focus of our external action beyond PESCO, as the European Union, especially security work, is very much on strengthening our partners' security capacities. I give you a few examples of actions we are already now taking as European Union, so all together. And this was already in place before PESCO was launched in the last years. This was very active. One is the work we're doing with Libya. We are training with Operation Sophia, the Libyan Coast Guards, more than 200 already trained. I think we will get to about 300 by the end of this year, which is a training that includes a part on respect of human rights and international standards done by the UNHCR and the IOM with us. So we keep the human rights component and the international standards component in that, which is quite revolutionary for the situation in Libya, as you can imagine, but it's an effort we think is essential to have. The other work we're doing with Libya is with UBAM, that has been trying and is consolidating its work to reform the civilian side of the security sector, in particular the judiciary, the border control management. And now we are looking at ways in which we can help them manage and control the southern borders on the eastern side of the country. We have already worked to control and to help them control the borders with Niger, and this has reduced the flow enormously into Libya. Now we're looking at ways in which we can help monitor and control the borders between Libya, Niger, Chad, and Sudan, which is where we see now the flows are mainly moving. Another example of work we're doing on the security sector in partnership with our African friends is in the Sahel, in Mali, where we have 2 missions and operations, and that are dealing mainly with training. That is related to trafficking, but also and mainly to counterterrorism and security. The two sometimes are connected because of the resources and the money flows, and in Niger itself. I give you another example that might seem far away from the issue of migration, but we have to keep in mind that it's not only Africa, the continent from which the flows are coming. We just started some months ago a new civilian mission in Iraq to help them reform the civilian security sector. And this is a fundamental step we've taken on the invitation of the Iraqi government. And I'm particularly proud because it's the first mission we have where we have included an expert on cultural heritage protection, which I believe can be in the future one element that we can include regularly in our missions and operations abroad, because this is a fundamental element not only for protecting or restoring the cultural heritage that in some cases is destroyed, but also it's a way of promoting the economy and tourism, and it's a way also to foster reconciliation. I just gave you a couple of examples, but I could continue. We're working also with other partners, not only in Africa, on strengthening their security capacities. I'm receiving a note saying that time is over for me. David, if you can do something with your European Parliament colleagues, I would be happy to stay. But I am afraid I will have to go now.
Thank you, Federica Mogherini, for being with us per video live conference, and have a good time now at the Election Observation Conference. I would say a warm round of applause for our High Representative for answering a number of questions.
Thank you. As always, it has been a pleasure, and I am really sorry I cannot be there in person with you, but I think this is the closest we could do to have a proper interaction also this time. And let me thank our Austrian friends and hosts not only for having arranged this, but also for the excellent cooperation we have established already in these first months of the presidency, also with the Austrian Parliament, a very good exchange and very good preparation also for this Interparliamentary conference. So a special thanks to them as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Federica. And we wish you also a good meeting in the European Parliament. Thank you for extending also your time. And we will also let you go to the European Parliament.